You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 372 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Early America was a diverse place, and a significant part of this diversity came from the fact that there were at least 1,000 different indigenous tribes and nations living in different areas of North America long before the Spanish and other European empires arrived on North America's shores. Now, every once in a while, it's a really good practice for us to explore the history and culture of one of these distinct tribes. Diane Hunter and John Bickers join us to investigate the history and culture of the Myaamia people. At the time of this recording, Diane was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma. She has since retired from that position. John is an assistant professor of history at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. And both Diane and John are citizens of the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, as well as experts in Myaamia history and culture. During our conversation, John and Diane reveal what we know about the history and origins of the Myaamia people before European contact, details about the Myaamia's ancestral homelands and the different elements that make up Myaamia culture and identity, and how contact with Europeans and Americans has altered Myaamia culture and their relationship with their ancestral homelands. But first, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation runs the world's largest museum dedicated to helping you investigate and explore the history and origins of the United States. And as the world's largest United States history museum, Colonial Williamsburg always has a lot of research, activities, and programming taking place all year round. To stay up to date with what Colonial Williamsburg and its scholars are discovering about the past, and to explore its wide range of activities and programming, sign up for one of its email lists at benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. Again, to sign up for one of Colonial Williamsburg's email lists, visit benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. All right, are you ready to investigate and explore the early American history of the Myaamia people? Let's go meet our expert guides. Today we have two guests. John Bickers is an assistant professor of history at Case Western Reserve University. He's an expert in the history of early America and in the history of the Myaamia tribe. John is also a citizen of the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, and he is working on his first book, which is tentatively titled The Myaamia Nation, A Middle Path for Indigenous Nationhood. We are also joined by Diane Hunter, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma. She's also a citizen of that tribe. Her work as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer involves preserving and protecting historic sites and resources, providing education about the presence and history of the Myaamia, and serving more than 1,200 tribal citizens in Indiana. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, John Bickers and Diane Hunter.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
As we know, early America was a place with a great diversity of peoples. And one of the peoples who lived in early America and continue to live in North America today are the Myaamia people. John and Diane, would you tell us about the Myaamia and their ancestral homelands?
According to our stories, our emergence as a people began on the St. Joseph River, which is between Lake Michigan and then goes around what is now South Bend, Indiana. And so somewhere between those two places on that river, we, as our story tells us, came out of the water. And we established a village there that we called Sakiweonge. We don't know exactly where we came from before we came to Sakiweonge. Based on some of our stories, we believe we came from the north. We have stories that talk about it being light all the time or dark all the time. So we believe that we were somewhere much further north, but we don't know exactly where. And we don't know who we were before that. But when we came out of the water, we were a unique and different people who came to be called Myaamia, or Myaamia people. After a time, we began to leave Sakiweonge, and over a period of years, established a number of villages, primarily in the Wabash River Valley and at what is today Fort Wayne, Indiana. So our homelands included not just those areas where we had villages, and we don't know where all our villages were, but it also included that broader landscape that we used for hunting and for other purposes. So it's centrally in Indiana, but western Ohio, southern Michigan, Illinois, and during the 1600s, Wisconsin as well.
Unfortunately, time travel doesn't exist. But if it did, and we could travel back in time, would you take us through a typical Myaamia village? What will we see and experience as we tour this village? Perhaps we could be walking through a village during the 17th century, or perhaps even earlier, before European contact.
Yeah, so I think mentioning the time period actually is really important in what we're going to be seeing here. For example, if we are talking about the 17th century, the 1600s, we're going to see really multi-ethnic communities. So Myaamia people, particularly during the Beaver Wars and these periods of early contact, are really living in what might be described as refugee communities, with the Shawnee, the Meskwaki, the Sauk, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, all these kind of Great Lakes communities that we think about. And these are all communities where we shared aspects of our culture, our languages were related to each other, think like Italian to French to Spanish, and we're all kind of living together. If we think about maybe earlier than that, pre-contact, I think what we're seeing is a lot more distinct Myaamia and Myaamia-specific communities. This is also a time period where as villages increase in population or as resources deplete, breakoffs happen. And so in the pre-contact period, as Diane talked about, we emerged at Sakaweyonge as Myaamia people. But after a time, the Wea tribe broke off from us. The Piankashaw tribe broke off from them. The Illinois will become the Illinois Confederacy, breaks off from them. And so it's a place that is really distinctly Myaamia in a way that is not in this later period as we're kind of forced to live with other peoples. In terms of the physical layout of the village, we had two particular dwellings. The standard would be the wikiami, a wigwam in English is what it's called, which is a dome structure made out of saplings and covered with cattail reeds. And then also some long houses, which were used for ceremonial or political larger group events or gatherings.
I might add that in our language, there are no words for indoors or outdoors because the wikiame, the wigwam, that domed structure that we lived in, we didn't really live in it. It was a place to sleep. It was a place to store our stuff, but we lived in the outdoors for the most part. So we didn't have that concept of going in and coming out.
John, you mentioned that during the pre-contact period, before the Myaamia ever meet Europeans, Myaamia villages tended to be distinctly Myaamia. What does it mean, or what did it mean to be distinctly Myaamia during this pre-contact period?
To answer that, I'm going to go back to that oldest story that Diane mentioned, the story of our emergence. Because it doesn't just talk about our coming out of the water, but it talks about us meeting a new people for the first time. And they describe the new people in comparing them to us in three distinct ways, which I argue is the Myaamia way of understanding community. And that is language, that is residency, so physically where you are living, what landscape you're living in, and material culture. So when they meet this new people in the story, they say, to our surprise, they spoke the same language we do. They describe them as living at Sakaweyonge, at this Myaamia place. So they're very similar to us, but they distinguish them by calling them Matekokasinakana, the old moccasin people. Old being a commentary on the moccasins themselves, so they're wearing an older style of moccasin. So the material culture is different than us. And those are really the three primary categories of understanding Myaamia-ness. It's not about blood quantum as it often is today. We had clan structures, but by the 1700s, they'd really started to go away for various reasons we don't fully understand. But for Myaamia people, being Myaamia, having a Myaamia identity, was more about cultural performance. So in that way, you could have a Potawatomi mother and a Myaamia father, but if you lived in a Myaamia village, spoke Myaamia Tawenge, the Miami language, and lived with Myaamia material culture in a Myaamia way, you were Myaamia. Similarly, you could be, and we see this very commonly in the post-contact period, you could be born to Quakers in Pennsylvania, but get adopted into the community by speaking the language, living with us in our communities, and adopting our material culture. It's not about biology. It can be about descent, but often not. It really is performative. It's about living as a Myaamia person in these really specific ways. Obviously, that has changed in the modern context for a variety of reasons.
Diane, would you tell us a little bit about the structure of these Myaamia villages, both in the pre-European contact period and by the 18th century, when John mentioned that there was this clan structure, which then disappeared from Myaamia culture, and we don't know why it disappeared?
So these villages, when they were just Myaamia, would have been generally a few extended families. So maybe up to 200 people, which would be about how many could be sustained by a large cornfield and the game and plants in the area. And when we lived in those villages, we had very distinct gender roles. Men were the hunters. They did most of the fishing. They were the traders. They would go out to other villages and trade what we had in excess of for what we had a need for. And they were also the ones who went to war and the ones then who made peace. And the men had two chiefs, a civil chief and a war chief. So the men are outside of the village a lot. The village is where the women are. And the women also had two chiefs, a civil female chief and female war chief. The women were our farmers. So these vast cornfields that we have, and it's documented, the great size of our cornfields, where we grew our own specific variety of corn. We call it minjipe. It's a white corn. Whatever the women are doing, the children are doing with their mothers until the boys are old enough to go with their fathers. So they're farming. They plant gardens. Each family has a garden with beans and squash and melon. And then, of course, gathering wild plants, roots, and milkweed was one of the plants. I still remember my grandmother stopping along the side of the road to gather milkweed to take home and cook. So these natural plants were part of our food always and into the late 20th century. And some people do still eat some of those same plants today. So the women made everything that we had. They built the wickiame, the dome-shaped houses. They sewed the cattails together to make the walls of the houses. Everything that happened within the village was done by the women. But when something important was going to happen, like the men were going to go to war, if the men were going to go to war, they needed all the things that the women would supply. So then the chiefs of the men and the chiefs of the women would come together in council and talk about, do we all agree that this is what's going to happen? And if so, what needs to be done to prepare for it? So there was a lot of gender distinctions, but certainly gender equality. There wasn't this sense that either men's or women's work was more important than the others. We valued everything that everyone did because it was necessary for our survival.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about governance. So Diane, you said at the beginning that the Myaamia homelands encompass this really big swath of territory with lands that run from the present-day states of Ohio and Illinois and then goes northward into southern Michigan. And that's just a very large area to have people spread out across. So how did the Myaamia govern themselves across this vast swath of territory?
This is a really important question because I think it's something that's often misunderstood about Native communities. When we talk about the Myaamia tribe, the Shawnee tribe, the Potawatomi, we tend to think of them in terms of, when we say the French, there's a monarch, there's a singular ruler, there's a singular government over everybody. And that's not the case for Myaamia people and for most indigenous communities, certainly in the Great Lakes and I think across the country. Each village was fully autonomous, able to make its own decisions, whether political, social, economic. They chose who they interacted with, either economically or militarily, and no community could dictate the policies or the patterns of another. So you see this frequently across Myaamia history where there will be some villages that allied with the French and traded with the French, while simultaneously others traded with the English. You had some who worked with the Iroquois Confederacy and some who worked with the Ojibwe. And there really wasn't this larger structure or hierarchy that could dictate community movements. And essentially, if an individual or a family within the village disagreed with the policies of that village, disagreed with its leadership, they could either move to remove the leaders, get someone else in charge that might agree with their viewpoints, which would require the majority of the village to agree with them, or if not, could leave and relocate to another village where they might have relatives but that represented their viewpoints. And so we have records, talk about like in the early 1800s, of a Myaamia family, what's now Whitley County, Indiana. And this woman now was in, I think, in her 80s or 90s, but she talked about when she was in her 20s. Her family had some kind of feud with the Akima, the male civil chief of the village, and he treated them very, very badly. And so they chose to leave, and they chose to relocate to a different village down the river. And that's how they would settle disputes within the community, either finding an impasse that could mitigate the situation or simply leaving and finding a place that was better situated. But what connected all these people were these things I just talked about with language, material culture, and residency. There wasn't this larger political connections, and you often saw Myaamia people making different political or social decisions based upon their needs at the time.
So when we talk about the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee Nation, the Catawba Nation, and others, we shouldn't conflate the fact that those confederacies and nations had larger governance structures as working for all tribes. As you said, the Myaamia seem to have had, and maybe still have, a very different structure of government than those larger nations and confederacies.
Yes, the idea of a tribe or a nation, as we talk about today, is historically contingent. And for Myaamia people, it's something that develops really in like the 1800s, primarily in response to American imperialism, American westward expansion into Ohio, Indiana, into Myaamionge, the Miami lands, the Miami country. But historically, in an ideal pre-colonial situation, they were allowed to live separately and independent lives.
Now, we've talked a little bit about how language is part of the distinct Myaamia culture, and how the language we speak is really an essential aspect of how we humans identify ourselves. We also know that language imparts knowledge about who language speakers are. So would you tell us more about the Myaamia language and how it has shaped and unified the Myaamia people?
Myaamia Tawenge, the Miami language, is part of the Algonquian language family. It's one of the largest language families in North America, and that directly tied us to the Shawnee, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Illinois, the Meskwaki. All these, again, we think of like larger Great Lakes, and a lot of Canadian tribes speak Algonquian language, which meant we shared a lot of similar cultural traits, although we were very distinct in other ways. It was a language that we shared with the Illinois Confederacy. At one time, we were one people that emerged from Sakawionge, but over time, we broke up into these different villages, these different communities, these different ethnic identities. But we continued to speak the same language. It was still mutually intelligible. Diane, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe the major distinction that was recorded by Europeans was speed. That the Illinois spoke very, very quickly, but we spoke very slowly. But otherwise, yeah, it was a language that was shared between all Miami, Illinois speaking peoples.
And while we're on the subject of language, Fallon would like to know if we know when the Myaamia language was first documented.
Our language was first documented while we were in Wisconsin in the mid-late 1600s. That's when the French first appeared to us, and the French Jesuits were there to convert us to Christianity. But to do that, they had to understand our language and our culture. So they wrote down everything that they could, that they found out about us, including our language. And so there's a Myaamia French dictionary that they created. And so that was the first time it was written down in what we today consider written language.
Yeah, I think there are 3 or 4 of these dictionaries that are created from like the 1670s to the 1700s. And I should also note, most of them are actually done in the Illinois dialect, the Miami Illinois language in the Illinois dialect, particularly with like the Kaskaskia and the Peoria, because that's who the French Jesuits were working with the most.
Does the fact that the Myaamia language was first written and documented by the French using the Illinois dialect of that language have any implications or ramifications for how the Myaamia people know their language today?
Several. I think perhaps the most important one is, as we've begun language revitalization since the 1990s, we have been incredibly fortunate to have these dictionaries. Not all communities have this extensive amount of language documentation. So it's become really, really crucial for understanding our language today, but also our language historically. Linguists have been able to actually compare the language used in these dictionaries in the 1680s to language recordings in, let's say, the 1920s. You can literally see like the change over time and how the language develops, like Old English, Middle English, Modern English. But there is an inherent bias in these materials. They see a lot of our spiritual or ceremonial life or a lot of our cultural practices through this European lens of savagery to civilization. So there's also a lot of derogatory comments in them about our culture or interpretations about cultural practices that we don't think accurately reflect a Myaamia worldview. So we have to be careful when using them how we're thinking about the bias of the person recording them and understanding even which Jesuit is writing this down, because that'll change how they're viewing these things.
I might add that John talked about recordings in the 1920s, and that's another important source of our language. Around the turn of the 20th century and into the first decades of the 20th century, ethnographers, amateur linguists talked to our speakers of our language, and they wrote down stories. With my great-grandfather, Gabriel Godfroy, Jacob Dunn made a small dictionary, a small glossary of words from that time. And so we have something a little closer. And even though our last fluent native speakers died around the 1960s, we have all this history recorded, not orally recorded, but certainly written down sort of phonetically so that we could understand the pronunciation. And in the late 1970s, there was a recording made with my grandmother, Swan Hunter, and she uses a few Myaamia words in this interview. So now the linguist can go back and say, this is how we think from the records that this should be pronounced, and that's how she pronounces it.
It's really fascinating how a spoken language and tradition like Myaamia can be documented in words that may not have been spelled properly by the French, and then those documents can really be used hundreds of years later to bring back a language, to bring back a spoken tradition.
They used to say that you couldn't bring back a language. Once the language lost its fluent native speakers, the language was dead and it could not be brought back. And our linguists have shown that that is not true at all.
Now, to switch gears, we've been talking a lot about the pre-European contact period. And now I think we should talk about the period of contact between the Myaamia and Europeans. So in episode 290, we spoke with Darius Coombs, who's Wampanoag, and he told us about the devastating impact European diseases had on the Wampanoag people long before the English separatists or pilgrims arrived along the coast of Plymouth Harbor. Did the Myaamia have a similar experience wherein diseases or some other element of European presence long preceded the Myaamia's actual contact with Europeans?
So this is a really complicated issue in that we're in some ways very ideally located and in some ways not ideally for this kind of question vis-a-vis European colonization. So you think about central Indiana, western central Ohio. The English are coming in New England, the French are in Quebec, the Spanish are coming in Georgia, Florida, Alabama. We're kind of equidistantly removed from all of them. So I think it's a fair assumption to say that we absolutely experienced these European diseases before contact with the Europeans, but it's really hard to document because we are so removed from Europeans. And so you have communities like the Wampanoag who are in New England, or there is that written documentation because Europeans are seeing it. And for better or for worse, we're kind of reliant on written European accounts to understand a lot of these things, unless there are traditional stories that talk about it. In the post-contact period, we know these diseases are absolutely present and they're devastating. But because we are kind of removed, we're in this kind of central area away from all European colonization, it's really unclear. I think it's a safe assumption, but it's really unclear. And there's a reason why our first contact with Europeans is with the French in Wisconsin when we're literally living in refugee camps, when we've literally fled from our homelands in Indiana and Ohio because of the Beaver Wars, that we're first meeting Europeans because we're so far removed from them, at least in the places where they're coming to colonize initially. So it's highly likely, but it's not documentable.
And speaking of the Beaver Wars, I think it's time we talked about them. So in addition to spreading diseases, Europeans often brought a lot of violence with them. And between 1640 and 1701, there was a prolonged period of violence referred to as the Beaver Wars, which caused a lot of violence all over the Myaamia homelands and the Great Lakes region, as well as throughout the Midwest in general and New York. John, would you tell us about the Beaver Wars and how these wars impacted the Myaamia people and their way of life in colonial America?
Before we can talk about that, I think we have to move back and talk a little bit about the Iroquois Confederacy, because they are impacted by European diseases very early on, very quickly, before they meet Europeans. Much like the Wampanoag, they're in a very similar situation. And these diseases are devastating to them. It is taking out an incredibly large portion of their population. And like Myaamia people, the Iroquois Confederacy had a tradition of adopting in new people to replace the deceased. In cases of violence, you would basically two options. You could either provide gifts to cover the loss of the deceased person. So if you murdered somebody, you or your family would provide gifts to cover that death, or the deceased family would adopt a new person to replace them. But that's in cases of human intervention, of human violence. In cases of disease where there's no clear culprit or actor that's causing this, your only option was adoption. And often this would be done through the taking of captives from other communities. And because the Iroquois' deaths were so dramatic and enlarged, they began very quickly attacking other communities, primarily to the west, but also a bit to the north and the south, to bring in new captives to adopt into the community, to make them Iroquois. And it took them several decades, but eventually they do hit Myaamia, they do hit the Miami country. And that's when we feel we're forced to flee from Indiana and Ohio. Although we're most documented in Wisconsin because that's where we met the French, we also moved into Illinois, we moved into Michigan. It wasn't a movement to Wisconsin, it was a movement out of Indiana. We're fleeing kind of our homelands here because, again, going back to what we were talking about before, the Iroquois Confederacy is really well organized. They have some level of centralization. They can act in unity in a way that Myaamia people and a lot of Great Lakes Algonquian-speaking peoples didn't. We were in these autonomous villages. So a coordinated response was more difficult, and so it was safer to simply flee. That's the context in which we meet Europeans.
Before the Beaver Wars began, did the Myaamia ever have regular contact with the Haudenosaunee or other indigenous neighbors?
We were enemies. They were always our enemy. Well, not always. There were occasions when there would be some working together, but for the most part, they were our enemies. So what was happening during the 1600s, during the Beaver Wars, was not new. It was just on a much grander scale.
So what happened when the Myaamia left Indiana and Ohio for the Upper Great Lakes region? You mentioned earlier that, yes, the Myaamia established some villages, but they were also living as refugees in Wisconsin because of the Beaver Wars.
Essentially, when we flee, we do, I think, what any people do. We find relatives. We look for people who are in safer spaces. So there's many Myaamia communities documented, like around the Grand Village of the Kaskaskia, which is a large Illinois settlement. In Wisconsin, we're living with the Meskwaki and the Menominee. In Michigan, we're living with the Potawatomi. So we're finding people we quite literally saw as relatives. We refer to the Illinois Confederacy as our younger siblings, the Potawatomi and Ojibwe as our elder brothers. So we're quite literally trying to find relatives that are in safe places, again, away from the Haudenosaunee, away from the violence. And we're not the only ones doing so. A lot of these other communities, again, the Shawnee in Ohio are also moving to Kaskaskia. The other communities, the Kickapoo in the Lower Great Lakes, are doing the same thing. And so we're all kind of end up living together in these shared spaces because we don't have time to make larger settlements or create these larger community structures that over generations we had done. And so everyone's just trying to find where's a safe place to be. It is a war zone in a really modern kind of sense of that term. And people are just trying to find where they can survive and where they can be safe.
Perhaps we need to clarify when we say we are looking for family, we're looking for relatives. That's not on a small scale relatives. People in these other Algonquian tribes that John mentioned are, in a sense, certainly within our language, our relatives. So they're people who speak similar languages, who have similar cultures, not the same, but more similarities than with the Haudenosaunee or with the Ho-Chunk, who would have been already in Wisconsin. So we're looking for people that are our relatives in a larger sense.
That's helpful to know because when we talk about relatives today in any context, most of us are talking about blood relatives. So it's interesting to think about relatives through language and other similarities in culture. How did intermixing and living with other indigenous peoples, linguistic family relatives, as it were, impact Myaamia culture, given that this war, the Beaver Wars, lasted for over 70 years?
There are a couple things. I think one, you do certainly see probably higher rates of intermarriage. Obviously, it's not exactly documentable, but it's a fair assumption that higher rates of intermarriage than we would have had previously. But also in terms of culture, we're also in these vast kind of trade networks with these communities already. And so there's already certain shared aspects of culture that are already existing. So like an example is the Calumet ceremony, which is taken from Calumet Stone in Minnesota, given to us by Siouan peoples, but that is spread across the Great Lakes, where Illinois, Myaamia, again, all these Algonquin peoples are having these shared kind of ceremonies, again, pre-contact. And so there's enough of these shared cultural traits, core pan-Algonquian traits, pre-Beaver Wars, that it made living together, I think, fairly easy. that we had these traditions, these ideas that we shared with them already because of these pre-existing relationships.
And it sounded like it was only when the Myaamia moved away from Indiana and Ohio that they came into contact with the French. You said it was while they were living in Wisconsin during the Beaver Wars. Would you tell us how the Myaamia came into contact with the French?
So the French are arriving in Wisconsin, what is now Wisconsin, around the same time frame that we're arriving. And they are seeking out relations with tribal people. First of all, the Jesuits, as we mentioned, are looking to convert Native peoples. But a lot of the other French were traders, and they were there to trade French manufactured goods for furs and other items. Probably before this, we were receiving goods from Europe that were traded to other tribes who then traded them to us. But now we have direct contact with the French, and so we are getting more and more French goods. And that changes our lives in a distinct way. For example, if we have always cooked our whole lives in clay pots, and suddenly we now have in trade metal pots, it changes our whole way of cooking. We cook in metal pots today because they cook better than clay pots. And we found that even in the 1600s, these metal pots are better for cooking. And of course, it's going to change how we prepare food. So a lot of the trade goods that we were getting from the French really impacted our lives.
I'd like for us to talk about the end of the Beaver Wars. Once the French were in the Myaamia's lives, it seemed like these Europeans were really in a place to broker a peace. And that peace was called the Peace of Montreal, 1701. And that peace ended the Beaver Wars. Would you tell us about the end of these wars and the Peace of Montreal?
It is a great peace. It is a treaty really in the truest sense of it ends this large, long war. And it's done between the French, the various Algonquian nations of the Great Lakes, and the Haudenosaunee. And essentially it sets up the new status quo for really the next century, in which the French, we designate them as father. And that means a really specific thing in a Myaamia and Algonquian context, in which a father is a provider. So providing is with the traders, providing goods. And a father is a mediator. So a father is a person that will resolve disputes between these communities. Essentially, it's setting up almost like a proto-UN in that sense, that the French become these figures that can mediate between disputes between these communities to prevent further warfare from happening, is the goal. But most importantly, however, it also allows for Myaamia people to return to Indiana and to Ohio. It brokers a peace that makes it safe to go back home. And we have to remember, this war has been going on for 50, 60 years. There have been whole generations of Myaamia people who have never been to their homeland, or at least the heartland of their homeland, on the Wabash River, the Wapashike-Sipiwe, that are now able to go home and to visit the graves of their grandparents who they may never have known, or elders returning back to the homes that they grew up in when they were forced to flee as children. So it's this really important moment in a larger macro socio-political sense, but it's also this really important personal moment for Myaamia people that it's now safe to go back home. And it's really interesting because we see the second we're allowed to, we go back to the exact same villages. We have documented villages pre-contact, and those villages still exist post-contact in the 1700s. So we're not just going back to our homelands in a broader sense, we're going back to the exact same spaces, which says how important these spaces are to Myaamia people.
History scholars usually look at early American history through a Euro-American lens. And when they use this lens, they define early American history and divide it into periods of warfare. So there's King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then, of course, the 7 Years or French and Indian War. And those are all wars that took place between 1689 and 1763, and there aren't many years of peace between those wars. And then, of course, there's the American Revolution and its War for Independence, which took place between 1775 and 1783. So really, when the Myaamia return home to their homelands, they aren't necessarily free of violence because the French and the British are really fighting each other in these wars for empire, and they're fighting each other with the help of Indigenous peoples. So what did these European conflicts mean for the Myaamia in particular and their return to their homelands and life in their homelands once they've returned?
Weirdly, we're in this really unique geographic position where we're between the French and the English. Indiana is kind of the south end of the French sphere of influence, but it's a decent trek from Montreal. And again, as the English are going into Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia, they're starting to move westward a little bit as they can try to expand, but still a solid distance from Myaamia to Philadelphia. So we're in actually this really good, unique position in which we're able to interact with both the French and English on our own terms. If we want to trade with them and gain goods or trade resources or political diplomacy, we can do so. And as often as not, if we don't want to, we don't have to. We're really able to engage with both communities on our own terms.
So it doesn't sound like these imperial wars really impacted the Myaamia with their violence. It sounds like the Myaamia were in this sweet spot where they lived in between these wars and their battlefields and really in between these two European empires.
Yeah, there's not really indication that we heavily participated in any of these conflicts. Again, when we wanted something from one of them, we would go to them. And there are wars within the continent that we participate in. So, we support the French during the Chickasaw Wars. So there are places where we clearly are allying with them militarily, but these larger wars of empire that historians love to talk about are really just not that important for us. It's shocking for Americans or Euro-Americans to hear, but a lot of their stuff didn't matter that much to us, that they weren't that important.
Now, the peace the French helped bring to the Wabash River Valley and the Great Lakes region in 1701 really didn't last that long. In 1775, the War for American Independence broke out in Massachusetts, and by 1778, that war entered the West and the region that we today call the Midwest. We need to take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, and then, John and Diane, we'd love to hear more about the Myaamia experience during the American Revolution. For nearly a century, Colonial Williamsburg has been a place of inspiration by discovering, curating, and presenting early American history through innovative and compelling programming. In 2026, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation will celebrate the United States' 250th anniversary as well as its own centennial. Through the power of place, the Centennial Campaign for Colonial Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg will expand its mission to reach and inspire people by investing in preservation, education, and civic engagement. They're investing in programming and work like Ben Franklin's World and the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. With your support, Colonial Williamsburg can achieve its mission to inspire people across the country and around the globe. For more information about the power of place, the Centennial Campaign for Colonial Williamsburg, and how you can help support programs and initiatives like Ben Franklin's World and the Innovation Studios, visit benfranklinsworld.com/power of place. That's benfranklinsworld.com/power of place. Diane and John, what was the Myaamia's experience like during the American Revolution? Were they a tribe that picked sides? Did they ever have a reason to enter this Euro-American political fray?
Historians do often say we allied with the British during the American Revolution. And that's because we engaged with the British during the American Revolution. And I would say it's probably more accurate to say we allied with the status quo. We're not loyal to king and country in that sense. We don't appear to have any kind of real policy on the Declaration of Independence. It is, we don't want to bring warfare into our spaces. If the Brits and the colonists fought it on their own over on the East Coast, we would be fine with that. But they're bringing it into our spaces, into our homelands, threatening our people. And that becomes an issue. But again, even they're very tacit. British, you take care of it. We're not going to send you troops. We're not going to fight for you. But we need you to handle this because it's now within our space. The only other thing I would also point out in the war is pre-revolution, we do not have a blanket term for what we call now the Americans or the colonists. We have different terms for different colonies or different groups of people. Particularly, we distinguish between the Pennsylvania Dutch and then the Virginians, the two major groups in our spaces. And obviously, George Rogers Clark is a Virginian. And that group of people, the Virginians, we call the Myaamia, the big knives, which is a term to denote their violence. We see them as very violent people. And this post-revolution becomes the blanket term for the United States, as we see this Virginian ideology becoming what is now the U.S. So it's not just that it's the British versus the colonists, or British versus the Americans, or the Americans are coming in with Clark. It's the Myaamia coming in with Clark. It's the Virginians coming in with Clark. These people that we view as innately violent people that are coming in. And that's what's concerning. It's not about the politics of the revolution itself. It's about who in the revolution is coming to our door.
I'm glad you brought up the Virginians, because the American War for Independence ends in 1783, and then something we call the Northwest Indian Wars begin. In 1763, King George III declares the Proclamation Line of 1763, And this is the British attempt to keep colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains and out of Indian territory. But the colonists were never happy about this policy because they wanted to move west. And then once the United States becomes an independent country in 1783, that British proclamation line disappears. There was nothing to restrict the colonists' movement west. So we do see a lot of Virginians and Pennsylvanians pushing past the Appalachian Mountains and moving into places like the Midwest, into the Myaamia homelands. So Kristen wonders if you could tell us about the Myaamia's involvement in the Northwest Indian Wars and whether they were involved at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794.
Myaamia people were smack in the middle of what we call the American Wars, because from our perspective, it's war with the Americans, right? There were at least 9 other tribes who were involved in these wars, and there were a number of battles. 3 major battles. The first was Harmar's defeat. Harmar attacked Fort Wayne, and we defeated him. And then in 1791, General Arthur St. Clair came up from Fort Washington, what is now Cincinnati, Ohio, with the intent to once again attack Fort Wayne. They stopped overnight, thinking that they were very close to Kikayonga, Fort Wayne. They thought they were on the St. Mary's River. In fact, they were much further away on the Wabash River near its source. And so they were stopped overnight, and we had been tracking them. And so these 9 tribes formed a crescent shape around St. Clair's camp and in the morning attacked, surrounding them. It was a great defeat for St. Clair and his men. In terms of the percentage of casualties in that war, it is the largest defeat of the U.S. Army ever. So we were defending our homeland. We were keeping the Americans back from invading our homelands. But then 3 years later, General Anthony Wayne was now in charge of the Army. He had spent those 3 years training his men, preparing them, and we met them again at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And it's considered a defeat for the natives. The number of casualties were almost equal on both sides. But we retreated and sought refuge at the British fort that was nearby, expecting them to let us in, and they didn't. And so that kind of sealed seeing the battle as a defeat for us. John, could you talk about why the British didn't let us in?
Yeah, so at the same time, the British are negotiating what becomes Jay's Treaty with the United States. And so the British commanders at the fort had received orders from London to not participate in any way against any military action against the United States, because it would threaten either to violate the treaty or blow up the entire negotiations. So the British at this point have no interest in helping us perpetuate the war, helping us defend our borders, because they're securing their own separate peace with the United States without telling us. They're undercutting us. We have reports from before the battle where they're actually often encouraging us to attack the United States and encouraging us to stand up and fight the US. And then when we turn to them and say, okay, we did it, but we need help, they quite literally shut the door on us. So, to what Diane said, it becomes a defeat in the sense that this is the moment where Myaamia people and other members of the Confederacy kind of realize we can't win this war. Because, as Diane pointed out, St. Clair's defeat is a massive defeat for the US. And they create this massive army under Wayne that Wayne spends years training using like Greco-Roman battle tactics. And the result's the same. Imagine wiping out an army and 3 years later the army's back but bigger. It becomes really, really clear that we can keep fighting this war. We can keep killing them. They're going to keep coming back, and they're going to keep coming back with more people. From a Myaamia perspective, the loss of even 5 casualties is a major defeat. And think about most Indigenous warfare prior to this time is really small scale. So we're talking about militias of maybe 20, 30 people. Again, even losing 5 people is a major defeat. And now we've got this large scale warfare where dozens, scores of people are dying. And the Americans don't seem to care. They're willing to throw away as many lives as possible to take these lands, to take what is now Ohio. And that becomes really clear in that moment at Fallen Timbers that we can wipe out their army, they will build a new one, they will send out more people, and now the British aren't going to actually help us anymore. They're not going to protect us. They're not actually our allies in the way that we thought they were.
The other concern with that is what happened after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. What happened after every battle is the Americans then went through our villages, burning our villages. They burned our cornfields. They destroyed our food stores. So even the battles that we won, once they'd burned everything, we're starving the next winter because we have no food. We have no place to live in many cases. Our Myaamia have been burned. And it's devastating, not just to the number of men who are killed in battle, but to our entire community.
So what happened to the Myaamia people after the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794? Diane, you mentioned the Scorched Earth campaign, so they were starving. But were the Myaamia able to keep control of their homelands?
We, like other tribes in this area after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, eventually sue for peace. The same thought that General Wayne has, who's also sending out messages to try to end the war, to establish some kind of peace. And at this point, we are very willing to do so. So there's a group of Myaamia people that go with other delegations to Fort Greenville, what's now Greenville, Ohio, to negotiate with the Americans. And our delegation's headed by Mishkanakwa, also known as Little Turtle. And he was kind of the lead Myaamia war chief during the war. He led Myaamia forces against St. Clair and Wayne in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And now he is delegated as the principal speaker for the Myaamia delegation. And he pushes back really hard against a lot of Wayne's claims. Wayne articulates these same kind of arguments that we hear today, that the French owned the Great Lakes. When the French surrendered to the British after the French Indian War, they ceded the Great Lakes to the British. And following the American Revolution, the British ceded this to the Americans. And Mishkanakwa pushes back really hard against these claims. You know, when we talk about Myaamia, the Miami homelands, he actually outlines that in the treaty negotiations of like, these are the Miami lands. And he lists out the rivers and the waterways, like, this is our land, we've ceded nobody. But ultimately, to end this war, to find peace, we and the other tribes present are forced to cede about 3/4 of what is now Ohio. So the eastern border of our homelands is the Scioto River, which goes down about halfway down the middle of Ohio. So the eastern lands in Ohio we cede aren't really part of our homelands, but we do cede basically what is the southeastern part of our homelands and what is basically the southwestern quarter. The northwestern quarter is retained as native lands, but we are forced to cede about 3/4 of what's now Ohio in order to end this war, to make peace. And there is this real thought that maybe this will be the end of it. The Americans have been gunning for the Ohio country since the French and Indian War and before. The French and Indian War started when George Washington and his militia comes up to what's now Pittsburgh and kills a French officer because they're trying to get the Ohio country. And now Washington's president and he's found a way to do it. They've been trying to do this for decades. Maybe if we just give them that actually will end it. Their people can go in and expand into what's now most of Ohio. We'll retain most of our homelands. The vast majority will still be under Myaamia control. And we can live our lives as we had. Again, there's this brief period of peace between the Great Peace of Montreal and then the French and Indian War. But then after that forward, it's just nothing but warfare. It's nothing but violence. If we have to cede some of our lands to the Americans to get peace, we're willing to do so. And we're not alone. A lot of the other tribes in the region are willing to do so. We're willing to take the chance that the Americans will keep true to their word and they'll have their land, we'll have our land, and we're done.
Diane, you mentioned earlier that the heart of Myaamia culture and homelands is in Indiana, and yet the Myaamia tribe is now the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. What happened to the Myaamia homelands in Indiana, and what made the Myaamia move to Oklahoma?
So after the Treaty of Greenville, as John said, the Americans had land that we had ceded, and we thought it was good. But the Americans violated those boundaries right away. And they start coming into what is now southern Indiana. And the further in they come, the more land they want us to cede in treaties. So we have treaties in 1803, 1805, 1809, 1818, 1826. In 1826, though, now they're not just saying, we want you to cede land. We want you to exchange land for land west of the Mississippi River, and we want you to go there. We agreed to cede land, but we refused to go. And they had no leverage to make us go until 1830 was the Indian Removal Act, which basically led to more laws and opened the way for them to remove Native peoples from our homelands. So we have another treaty in 1834. Again, they want us to go west. We say no. We do cede a little bit of land, but we're not going to go. And then in 1838, we cede all but one portion of our communal lands. And we say, we'll think about going west. We didn't say we would, but we said we'll think about it. And 2 years later, in 1840, we signed another treaty. And in that treaty, we ceded the Great Myaamia Reserve, that last piece of communal land, in exchange for land west of the Mississippi. And we agreed that within 5 years, we would go there. No one wanted to go. Not even the men who signed the treaty wanted to go. So we kept putting it off and putting it off. We can't go this year because we have to harvest our crops first. We can't go this year. We own privately owned land and we have to sell that before we can leave. Just anything that we could do to put off leaving. 5 years come and go. Late September 1846, the U.S. Army arrives at our villages, rounds us up from our villages, and takes us to a prison camp in Carew, Indiana. And on October 6th, they boarded us onto canal boats on the Wabash and Erie Canal and took us from our homes. We went east into Ohio, and then we took the Miami and Erie Canal south to Cincinnati. From Cincinnati, we took steamboats along the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri rivers to the town of Kansas, today's Kansas City, Missouri. And then we went overland from there 50 miles south to the new Miami reservation. After 20 years, the U.S. wanted us to remove a second time, and we were removed again to northeastern Oklahoma, and that's where the tribe is today.
What has the move away from traditional Myaamia homelands in Indiana and the Midwest meant for the Miami people?
We are a divided people. There were a few families who by treaty or by legislation were allowed to remain in our homelands in Indiana. So now we have people in Indiana and we have people in Kansas. And then with the removal to northeastern Oklahoma, we now have Miami people in 3 places. Today, we're all over the United States, but at that time, primarily in those 3 locations. What that meant was we had small groups of Miami people living among people of a different culture. And when that happens, it's difficult to maintain your own culture. And you start adapting to the ways of the people around you. You assimilate to that. And in that process, our own culture and our own language start to go to sleep. We no longer practice many of our cultural practices. We don't speak the language, many of us. And it had a devastating effect on our ability to maintain what has always been Myaamia culture and language.
The impact of removal cannot be understated, both for Myaami people who were forced to remove and those who remain behind in Indiana. On our language, our lifeways, our traditions, because even those who were removed, while surrounded by more native peoples than those who remained in Indiana, they're being surrounded by other non-Myaamia native peoples. And so by 1870, they were being removed to Oklahoma. The Western Myaamia population is, I want to say, about 70 people. It's incredibly small. And although they're surrounded by other peoples in the Indian Territory, they're non-Myaamia peoples. They're people who spoke different languages, had different cultures, had different relationships with the U.S. And as Diane said, it becomes really, really difficult to maintain a distinct language and culture and identity. Even if it's not being forced into an American identity, it's being forced into this more pan-Indian identity. Because again, when you have 70 people, that's not a lot of people to be able to maintain an entire language and culture and nation. It becomes very, very difficult to do so. When the Myaami tribe arrives in Indian Territory, we're one of, if not the smallest tribe in the Indian Territory. Again, people like the Cherokee and Choctaw have over 10,000 citizens, but even the Quapaw or the Wyandot have a couple hundred. Even though they're small tribes, they're enormous compared to what my people that are coming to Oklahoma are. And that makes it really, really difficult. And then for those who remain in Indiana, you are completely surrounded by Americans. You are completely surrounded by English speakers. There are no other native peoples near you. And again, it makes it very, very difficult to maintain your language and culture. And there's a lot of pressure to not maintain it. Those who remain in Indiana are still being shipped out to the boarding schools, or they're being sent to public schools where it is all English. and it's American culture. And it makes it really, really difficult. You asked at the very beginning of this, what are the things that defined Myaamia-ness in this early period? It's language, it's residency, it's material culture. Removal really damages all that. We're forced to rely more on American clothing and material culture from traders. We're not all living together. We're literally scattered into these 3 population centers and today across the United States, and our language is going away. It makes it really, really hard to maintain these core ideas of what it means to be Myaamia. And so we're also forced to change what does it mean to be Myaamia. Today, we are much more tied to lineage and band affiliation and tribal enrollment in terms of defining who is Myaamia because we've lost so much, and all that begins with removal in 1846.
The Myaamia have such a long and rich history, and we've just scratched the surface of it in our conversation. As we move towards the end of our exploration of this long and rich history, what would you like us to remember most? Or perhaps, what is the one thing that you'd really like us to know and understand about the Myaamia people and their culture?
So often we do talk about history, about the past, and people believe that Miami people are extinct. We've had our children, people look them in the face and say, Miami people are extinct. We are not extinct. We are not a people of the past. We are a living people.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the Myaamia people had never become involved with Europeans? How might Myaamia history have turned out differently?
I think one of the things to consider in that is, would we in the 21st century still be living as we did pre-contact? And the answer is no. Nobody stays in one place. Our culture would have grown, would have evolved. We would be living in very different ways, but in still a Myaamia way. But it would look 5 centuries more recent. We would not be living as we did, but we also would not be living as we are now. We would have maintained being Myaamiake, Miami people.
I think if we had not engaged with Europeans, to a certain extent, things wouldn't necessarily have been that different. I mean, you can talk about the first interaction with the French. We're not coming to the French. They're coming to us. Most native European or American interactions are not native peoples coming to Europeans or Americans saying, please give us whatever it is you have. Please give us Christianity. Please give us your tools. Please give us guns. It's Europeans coming saying, we want this, this, and this from you. And we say, okay, but there's going to be some kind of exchange here. And so I think if we had never engaged with Europeans, at some point we would have met the Americans. Unfortunately, I don't see a reality in which the Americans don't cross the Ohio River. They don't come into the Ohio country. Even if we never interacted with the French or the British or had any of that history, I don't see a reality playing out in which the Americans don't come west. So what may have happened, we may have been more similar to Western tribes who had limited European interactions and really didn't meet anyone until the Americans. And so we might have had an experience more similar to them. But I think anything post 1790s, I think plays out fairly similarly. Not because of who we are or what we're doing or what our interests are or how that changes. Even that reality, I don't see that changing the Americans or the goals of the federal government.
So, John, you're working on a new book that you've tentatively titled The Miami Nation, A Middle Path for Indigenous Nationhood. Would you give us a sneak preview of your book in progress?
Yes. So my book actually follows what we call the American period, starting with the Treaty of Greenville and extending until the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma ratifies our first constitution in 1939. And essentially, I'm trying to take back the concept of indigenous nationhood. Most historiographies on nationalization, centralization in any given country essentially argue that it is a foreign American European concept that's brought to native peoples. So you think about groups like the Cherokee Nation, who they develop patriarchy and centralized structures and a written constitution and separation of powers and they're really modeling off the US. And historians basing it off them have really argued that any kind of sense of nationalization, of centralization, has to be modeled off the US. And what I'm arguing in this book and looking at the Myaamia tribe as an example is that no, it doesn't, or doesn't have to. And so I look at, following the Treaty of Greenville, how Myaamia people create a centralized national government, the Miami National Council, that is entirely based in traditional Myaamia political ideologies, ethos, and mechanisms. A government that allows us to unify our villages to confront the United States, but also allows us to retain the authority of women in these communities, allows the retention of female chiefs, that allows villages to retain some level of autonomy, that is based on non-coercive authority, but is nonetheless this larger centralized structure that is forward and outward facing and dealing with the United States, but allows Myaamia people internally to maintain our lives as best we can, as we always had been. And then looking at how that centralized government handles our two removals, how it deals with education policies or land use policies in experimenting maybe with private property, maybe with some American education, but always in ways that are Myaamia at its core, that we're never trying to model ourselves off the US, that we're trying to figure out how to deal with the US and other state governments, but in a Myaamia way, and how we're able to use nationalization to defend Myaamianess and not to adapt to Americanness.
And Diane, as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma, part of your job is protecting historic sites and resources. Would you recommend a few historic sites that we should visit so that we can better understand and learn even more about the Myaamia people and their history?
So there are not a lot of built sites remaining for Myaamia people. In Oklahoma, we have a few historic houses that the tribe owns today, and they're in or near the town of Myaamia, Oklahoma. In Indiana, in Fort Wayne, the home of our first principal chief, Pinjewa, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, his house is still there. It's owned by the Fort Wayne History Center, and on the first Saturdays of the months May through November, the house is open for tours, and there's always some other kind of activity or event going on. So people can visit the house and see how our chief lived. Places like the Seven Pillars, it's a natural limestone formation on the Mississinawa River near Peru, Indiana. It's still there and still an amazing place to see. And then there are sites that are not necessarily Myaamia, but certainly we have connection to in one way or the other. In southwestern Indiana, there's Angel Mounds. It was a Mississippian site, and the mounds are there, and they are beautiful. And it's truly an amazing place, as are the sites in Ohio called Hopewell. Both Angel Mounds and Hopewell are named for the farmers who had the land. It has nothing to do with the actual culture there. But the Hopewell earthworks in southern Ohio are from around the year 500. And again, they're amazing structures that still stand, except where they have been destroyed by Euro-Americans. Both of those sites are real examples of the genius of early Native peoples of what is now the Midwest. The knowledge and the skills that were taken to create these earthworks is staggering, and they are well worth a visit.
As we've said, the Myaamia people have a long and rich history. Where do you recommend that we go to find more information about the Myaamia? Are there books that we can read or websites we can visit or even other resources that you can recommend for us?
There are not particularly good books right now. There is a book that was written by Bert Anson, the Miami Indians. It's over 50 years old now. So it gives some fairly good facts, but it's old and doesn't give a Myaamia perspective. But we do have a community blog that has a number of articles about our history. The blog's name is achimotatiyangwe.org. So what you need to do is to Google Myaamia community blog, and that will get you to it, rather than trying to spell that whole word. So that is a good source for Miami history. Not complete by any means, but it is a good source. We do have some basic information about the tribe today by going to the tribe website. Easier to find, it's miamination.com.
And we'll include links to both of those resources in our show notes. Diane Hunter and John Bickers, thank you for joining us and for sharing Myaamia history and culture with us. It's been fascinating to explore with you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Until the 19th century, the 1800s, the Myaamia people comprised a culturally united tribe that organized themselves into different villages in the Wabash River Valley. Their ancestral homelands stretched from Ohio to Illinois, and their heart is in the present-day state of Indiana. Like many indigenous peoples, the colonialism of early America and the United States' 19th century policies of Indian removal and cultural assimilation have wreaked havoc on Myaamia ways of life and have even divided the tribe among three primary areas of residence: Indiana, Kansas, and Oklahoma. As Diane and John shared, the impact of removal cannot be understated. But even before the United States Army and government physically removed most Myaamia people from their homelands in Indiana and then Kansas, the Myaamia experienced upheaval and had to work on cultural survival. The Myaamia view three elements as essential to their culture: language, material culture, and physical residency. In the period of early America, if you spoke the Myaamia language, used and created Myaamia material culture, and resided in a Myaamia village, then you were considered Myaamia because you performed these essential elements of culture. The Beaver Wars, which took place between the 1640s and the Peace of Montreal in 1701, caused an early period of cultural upheaval. To escape the violence and threat of capture that the Beaver Wars brought to Myaamia homelands in Ohio and Indiana, the Myaamia relocated to Illinois and Wisconsin, where they lived among their linguistic and trade relatives, the Meskwaki, Illinois, and Potawatomi. Living and intermarrying among related but different indigenous peoples and cultures away from the Myaamia homelands for 50 to 60 years brought a period of cultural change. However, that period of cultural change was not as great as living among different and unrelated indigenous peoples and Americans, as the United States forced most of the Myaamia people off their homelands in Indiana and further divided them between Kansas and Oklahoma. As Diane noted, it became challenging for the Myaamia to speak and practice their language and even aspects of their material culture, which are both vital elements of their distinct culture. Yet the Myaamia people are alive and well in our 21st century. As John and Diane stressed, the Myaami are not extinct. Like Americans, the Myaamia people are a living people who continue to adapt and change their ways of life with time and circumstances. And like Americans, the Myaamia are a people with a history they use and turn to as they work on reawakening different aspects of their culture, like their language. The Myaamia are using their oral traditions, those 17th century French Miami dictionaries that the French created, as well as early 20th century audio recordings, to bring back their ability to speak their language and reawakening this essential aspect of their culture. And one last thing, we should consider the view offered by Diane and John. To the Myaami people, the Northwest Indian Wars are the American Wars. The independence of the United States did bring profound change and dispossession for the Myaamia, but the American Revolution is not in itself an event that they view as a watershed moment in their history and culture. That's just something for us to think about as we continue to explore the history of early America and the United States. Look for more information about Diane, John, and the resources they offered, plus links, notes, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/372. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Joseph Edelman, Katie Shinnebeck, Ashley Bachnight-Claybrooks, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what do you think about the Myaami point of view when it comes to early American history? Is it a viewpoint that has caused you to see early America and the United States a bit differently? I'd love to know what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.